Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I'm your host, Maryann Petri, and I have a brand new guest. His name is Rick Black. He has the website www.cearjustice.org. Their headquarters are located in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they have been advocating for seniors and dependent adults, as well as those exploited by the legal community in equity court proceedings since 2014. This experience has caused Rick to leave his profession and begin studying guardianship files and proceedings in Nevada and nationwide. His research with local media and the Nevada Attorney General gained a statewide investigation into adult guardianship abuse. As of 2020, those efforts have yielded massive statewide reforms, 10 convictions of Nevada attorneys and professional guardians who use guardianships as a cover for their criminal acts. 2 cases in Clark County were scheduled to head to trial, and that was in 2020. And since 2014, CEAR has investigated and counseled over 5,000 cases nationwide of suspected DPOA, trust, and adult guardianship and probate frauds orchestrated by the predatory legal community. I welcome you to the show. Rick Black, how are you doing this morning?
Thank you, Maryann. It's great to be here.
I'm glad to have you. So when did this all start as far as, this website and putting it together?
Yeah, I'm an engineer by training. I spent most of my career with General Electric and then worked for private equity. My family and I lived all over the US and overseas during my career. And then unfortunately in 2013, my wife's father, Del, was suffering from dementia, and we discovered that his roommate and landlord was exploiting him. She had stolen $220,000 from him and had worked aggressively to hide the extent of his dementia from the entire family. That was June 22nd of 2013, which is a day that completely changed my wife and my life forever, because we called to help him. We alerted him because my wife was on all of his bank accounts that, hey, there's a problem here, and can you explain it, or appears to be a problem. And he immediately denied that he had ever signed any checks to move any money. And at that point, the landlord, we discovered, was eavesdropping, and we were never able to be alone with him again. We immediately went to Vegas to try to help him. Local police would not engage. We were not allowed to visit with him. Matter of fact, we were told before she hung up, come get your dad, I'm done with all of you. And we were more than happy to execute that demand. But when we arrived in Vegas less than 24 hours later, it was a very different reception, and we were not allowed to see him. Police would not engage. Normal response from local law enforcement. They directed us to family court to file for guardianship, claiming that this was a civil matter, and that's how they resolve these matters in Nevada. And that was a mistake that we'll have to live with the rest of our lives. We then got into guardianship litigation, and that went on for a year. And ultimately, the judge rewarded the landlord with plenary guardianship over my father-in-law after the attorneys had liquidated nearly $1 million of my estate and his estate through frivolous litigation. The only silver lining in our experience, because Dad died 2 years later, the first time we got to be alone with him was standing by his coffin after he had died, which is typical in these cases. But we were able to elevate the evidence to law enforcement after we figured out really what was going on behind the scenes. And 2 years after his death, his landlord and roommate was convicted of felony theft and exploitation for her actions before she was awarded guardianship. One further twist on it, and it really builds on why we've built SEAR and why we advocate for people nationwide. 2 years after that, the Supreme Court of Nevada overturned the conviction on a technicality, and the DA was unwilling to retry this woman because she at that point was 80 years old. Her first offense was a first offense ever in her life, and he just didn't have the resources to waste his time retrying an 80-year-old woman who likely wasn't going to exploit anyone else. And they immediately, upon the overturn, reopened the guardianship case at that point, 5 years after this man's death, to extract another, ultimately $45,000 out of our family, claiming that their services had not been paid for during the guardianship. The point that I make with that horrendous story very quickly is this system, the equity court system, child custody, adult guardianship, divorce, probate, it's a system managed by, it has a very low burden of proof, it has very poor oversight, it's very poorly funded, and it's been pretty much designed and operated by the state bar nationwide. And every judge, at least certainly the higher level judges, are members of the bar. And this is a profit center for bar members: divorce, child custody, adult guardianship, probate. And the Supreme Court of Nevada was going to make sure that they protected their peers. That's my opinion.
Mhm.
But clearly in our case, the Mencarelli Black family was fully exploited, and the attorneys of Clark County, Nevada were rewarded quite handsomely from the ordeal that all occurred because law enforcement would not take action when it was most appropriate to stop an exploitation in process. So after that experience, we started working with the Attorney General, because what we learned in the process was that this was a pattern and practice within Clark County. There were hundreds of records that supported the reality. Fortunately, Nevada is an open record state, so I could get access to every file, every document, which is unique. It's the only state that I'm aware of where that potential exists. Some states you can see the registry or the docket on every case, most cases, because many judges seal cases, but you can't see all the filings, and the filings are most important, and the financial filings are the most important of all. The inventory and the annual accountings, that's where you pick up where the funny business on the finances occurs, because what we found in Nevada was 4% of all the cases that we analyzed, 4% actually had all the financial documents filed. And so you recognized this is just a machine for exploitation by bar members. And the hearing master, who had been hearing adult guardianships for 10 years, a fellow by the name of John Norheim, was more than happy to oblige his fellow members of the bar. We then went on to work for an activist group called NASGA, National Association to Stop Guardianship Abuse. They're out of Indiana, run by a woman, Elaine Lenoir. We worked with them for about 1.5 years until we saw that our goals differed from theirs. I then went on to work as a free volunteer in all these after I left my profession in 2015. And then went on to work for Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship, AAAPG, run by Dr. Sam Sugar out of Miami, Florida. And after 1.5 years of working with Sam, it was clear we had to take our agenda in a little different direction. And so my wife and I started SEAR, the Center for Estate Administration Reform, in January of 2018.
That's such a tremendous story. You had mentioned that they liquidated his estate, and did I misunderstood your estate as well?
Yeah, because the way guardianship works, all the attorneys in the affair feed off the estate of the ward. As soon as any type of order for guardianship is signed, temporary, limited, they all use different words, but it's all the same. A judge has signed an order that gives a third party the ability to completely take over your assets. And at that point, when you fight them, when they've inappropriately taken a loved one, you have to come up with your own funds And in our case, because we live in Charlotte and the proceedings were in Nevada, 2,000 miles away, we went and hired, because we could afford to, what we thought were some of the best attorneys in town. And those attorneys charged us $600,000 in the 2 years of litigation before we ultimately fired them. And my wife represented herself pro se, did quite well for some time, but ultimately we ended up hiring another attorney, and the bills just kept mounting as we were fighting to get the family court in Las Vegas to recognize the evidence and honor the law.
Mm-hmm.
The issue in equity courts, Maryann, is laws are almost meaningless. And I say that just a little bit tongue in cheek, because you really don't have an exit ramp. You don't have a true check and balance that has the interest of the affected parties in mind. An appeal only looks at the last order that was signed, and only looks at an order that was signed usually within the previous 30 days. So when these predatory attorneys get litigation going based on the big lie theory, and they all understand the value of lying in a courtroom, once you let an order go without an appeal, that snowball becomes an avalanche very, very quickly, and it will bury you. It'll bury your loved one, and it'll bury the family who's attempting to protect a loved one, because they capture the assets from both sides. They capture the assets that were held by the alleged incapacitated person, and then the family's got to come up with funds if they really want to legitimately fight it.
So, I mean, this is terrible. So when your wife represented herself pro se, how far did she get, and when did she decide to stop and hire an attorney?
We didn't go far. When the verdict came down in July of 14, because and this is, I mean, we can talk about the typical scams that the attorneys run in these affairs, but in in August of 2013, this was presented as a family squabble. Well, this woman wasn't family. She wasn't on any of the state documents. There was nothing there except that she was holding him hostage in her home. But to resolve the family conflict, as the judge said, he appointed a temporary professional guardian who immediately aligned with the nefarious party, which happens routinely nationwide, and certainly every time in nefarious or in fraudulent adult guardianships. And that proceeded for a year until we finally got the judge to let us have an evidentiary hearing to go through all the evidence and make a determination who should be the guardian, the professional guardian, the woman who was isolating the man, or his daughter, who was on his only child, who was on all of his estate documents. The judge expertly drained our assets. The trial lasted for 34 days, 13 different days of testimony, each time requiring my wife and I to, because I was working at the time, to fly back and forth from Las Vegas, from Charlotte to Las Vegas, to be present, to be a part of this as we fought for her dad. And in the end, he decided that this woman, who at that point was recognized as being under criminal investigation for her acts prior to the guardianship, he awarded her plenary guardianship. And at that point, it really completely removed our entire family from any ability to protect dad. And he died a year later. But I'm sorry, circle me back, Maryann, because you asked a question there, and I don't think I quite answered it.
Well, you kind of did, because I had asked, so they liquidated his assets, which would have been your wife's inheritance, and then they also went after yours?
Well, oh, no, it was about representation.
Oh, sorry, yes.
To get the case through the evidentiary hearing, which was a $75,000 or $80,000 affair, 13 days of testimony. That we fired, as soon as we got the verdict, the attorney said, I'll never forget the quote, he must have shit in his ears, or it was shit in his ears was the comment. And I thought, well, that might be appropriate, but I'm out over $1 million, our family, and we just lost dad permanently. And that's the best you could do. And then when I said, okay, where do we go from here? And they said, well, we would quit. Now, what we should have done at that point was immediately appeal that order with all the evidence that we had, because we spent another, I don't know, $300,000 in overall between his estate and our own to try to get this thing resolved over the next 8 years. So again, what we promote to victims who call SEAR is you got to do, once you recognize you're in a trap, and these truly are traps. This is organized crime to lock families amongst a group of attorneys, nothing formal on pieces of paper, but a very clear understanding. On the tough points, I'm going to remain silent so you get what you want, and you're going to give me what I want, and we're all going to keep this litigation going because that's what we do, and the system allows us to do it. So they didn't want to appeal, so we fired them. And my wife represented herself for less than a year, first half of 2015. And probably the best victory we got in the whole journey was just before Dad died, he finally was admitted to a hospital. And we spent the entire month of June of 2015 in Vegas tracking him from hospital to hospital, because his guardian and exploiter, every time she got somebody to agree with her, she would drag him out of a facility back into her home where she could fully isolate him. And then he would relapse because he was dying, and she would have to take him back to the hospital, and then we would get to see him again. And then this vicious cycle went on. And when we presented data to the judge of the AMAs, that's a medical term for without medical approval, an AMA, come on, Rick, against medical advice. Anytime you're admitted to a hospital and you're under the care of a doctor, you as a loved one, you as a patient, don't have the privilege of making a decision to outpatient yourself, to take yourself out. And in at least one case, we had a very embarrassing and accurate description by a doctor about how she came into this rehab center at 3 o'clock in the morning and drugged this man out and was at risk of injuring him and killing him based on the negligence interactions. And with that, on June 26th of 2015, the new judge, because we got the existing judge removed by court order because of all the evidence that we had exposed. Actually, 3 judges removed from ever hearing adult guardianships. The new judge then gave my wife co-guardian of person on June 26th of 2015. And that happened to be the day that we were flying back to home, and we couldn't get him stopped because she immediately moved to get him out of hospice and back in her home. And that's indeed what occurred, because we couldn't overrule her being co-guardian, and he died 7 days later.
I'm so sorry.
This is, I mean, I appreciate the condolences and the sympathy, Maryann, but 5,000 cases, our phone rings every day of the week, 7 days a week now, with almost a new case, a brand new case every day, where these stories are repeated. Isolate the victim, defame legitimate protectors, liquidate the estate. The equity court system, the state bar disciplinary system, the judicial disciplinary system in every state is laughing at every American because they know there is no obligation and nobody looking over their shoulder to make sure that this system works as the American public has been led to believe that it works. We all need to understand the American Bar Association and each state bar association is a lobbying group. It's a social group. It isn't a disciplinary group. It isn't an oversight group. It promotes the ability of attorneys to make money, lots of money. And when we let attorneys do our legislative lobbying efforts and build our laws, and we don't provide the checks and balances, which is the voices of the victims in this case, the bar is going to do their job to make sure that they build a fortress around the probate and equity court system that serves their interest over ours.
You know, I just interviewed Michael Volpe yesterday. He would be season 3, episode 66, and he put in an act called the Elaine Pudlowski Act in the state of Connecticut, which would get rid of third-party interference such as guardian ad litems, custodial visitation, I don't know, I can't even talk today. But so, you know, if that can happen, hopefully, you know, in the state of Connecticut, maybe that could get passed around the whole United States. Possibly that could help guardianships.
We got to get behind it. You know, the guardian ad litem role in the equity court system is a problem linchpin. Those folks who sign up to be guardian ad litems, which are court-appointed investigators, they have a special ex parte relationship with the judge. They know they can swing a case with anything they say. Those roles are important, but the more important role is having zealous, trained, independent counsel for the ward that is paid by third parties, free in this case, so paid by the government, or in every case paid by the government, instead of by the state. When you look at the design of these courts, all they want is to get the court to write that first order, because with that first order, all the attorneys get to feed off the estates of the family members. And that's the twist. If we were a benevolent society that truly followed a moral compass, I don't care what your faith is, I don't care what your political party is, but let's just follow a moral compass. Guardianship works. Divorces happen. People have to mediate those things. Child custody happens. People have to mediate it. But the problem we have, because of our liberal society today, everybody gets to involve themselves in it to look out for their personal interest, namely the attorneys, versus the greater good of the whole, which is to support the victims that are drawn into the environment because they have a conflict that needs resolved. I love Michael. He's done a lot of great work over the years. But you got to study this and really understand, okay, can you abolish guardianship? No. Can you abolish GALs? No. But simple things could be implemented, like a guardian ad litem cannot talk to the parties without being videotaped. I want total transparency on what goes on in these proceedings and outside these proceedings. The attorneys don't want that. Most states seal all of their family court and all of their probate records because the bar likes it that way. They want to make sure the only people that really know what's going on are the members of the bar. And that puts the public at a severe disadvantage. But in Nevada, the best reform that we put in place that is still paying dividends today, where it's managed appropriately, because any system can be corrupted when there's no true oversight. But the best reform was we got federal funds to set up a legal aid society to get a signal from the court, pick attorneys who are trained to zealously counsel for the rights of the alleged incapacitated person, the respondent. That's a key point, Maryann, because the respondent is the person being petitioned for guardianship. So that attorney gets assigned by a third party. They go out to the home. They lay eyes on the
Mhm.
proposed ward. They talk to the proposed ward. They talk about the costs of guardianship, the risk of guardianship, the obligations of your guardian. They talk to the family, and they make an independent assessment what is in the best interest and the expressed interest of my client, the respondent. That's all done before an order for guardianship can ever be signed. That's the most, if we could have one thing nationwide, and we have a bill that's currently before several states, and we've had a lot of discussions in Washington, D.C. about funding this program nationally so that there's going to be a pool of zealous trained counsel for respondents. That single change reduced the number of guardianships in Clark County, Nevada, the biggest county in Nevada, 2.2 million people. It's all of Las Vegas. Reduced guardianships by 60% in the first year that it was implemented, and they have continued to stay low since 2018 when it was put in place. Not another state in the country has free counsel for wards. The only one that comes close would be California, and they have perverted the system by assigning public defenders to the role who have absolutely no training, and they get minimum wage to provide the defense of the respondent, and they pretty much go along to get along. And so we have a serious fraudulent conservatorship, is what they call it in California, in the state of California.
Mhm. Wow, this is just, it's so overwhelming because like a year ago or so, I didn't even know what a guardianship was. You know, I mean, other than watching The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and I saw in the movie that she was a ward of the state and how she was abused. But, I'm like, what's up with that? And then I start learning about this. It's just this is just disgusting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and people don't know that they're sitting ducks, and this goes along with family court, CPS, coming after kids, coming after the elderly. Do you
Yeah,
think
the parallels are absolute. And we have worked to align with Families Rise, a grassroots activist team group in California, others on the CPS family court agenda, because families are being torn apart, again, by predatory attorneys, but also these state agencies that get paid, get rewarded by putting more people, more census into their health and human services roles? The US DHHS allocates $3 trillion a year today out to the states in programs to support the disadvantaged and the destitute. $3 trillion a year and growing. Most states have increased their Medicaid rolls by more than 50% over the last 10 years. And one of the easiest risk-free low-cost head for Medicaid is someone in guardianship. Mm-hmm. So you've got CPS with their sister state department. You have APS, Adult Protective Services, with their sister organization, Department of Children and Families in Florida, Department of Social Services in California, Department of Human Resources in Colorado. Every state names it a little differently, but it's all the same. They're getting billions of dollars in federal aid, and they need to grow their head count to justify getting more of those dollars from the federal government. Now, it would be great if those monies were going directly to the benefit of these individuals, but there are thousands of companies between the federal groups that allocate the funds, block grants, and the actual receivers that mostly benefit from these funds. Long-term care facilities, rehab centers, vast majority, 80% of the revenue in our long-term care facilities across this country, including group homes, comes from the federal government. So we've got this system that we've established since the Depression and grown even further since 1965, when Medicaid really took off that is serving itself versus serving the public. And within that, you also have entitlement trafficking by the beneficiaries of those funds through the use of adult guardianship. We break down fraudulent guardianships into two arenas: estate trafficking, entitlements trafficking. There's some fringe cases that are just done by pure negligence on people's part, overzealous power players. But for the most part, this is driven by money. It's driven by greed. And that greed is acquiring the estate assets or the federal entitlements.
You know, you just wonder when this will ever stop, which I don't know if it ever will.
Well, I wouldn't keep fighting. I don't want to put you with my wife. We wouldn't stop fighting, or we would stop fighting rather, if we thought we couldn't make a difference. Mm-hmm. It's never going to stop. Evil is as real as goodness. And sadly, evil will always be able to work in dysfunction. And there's plenty of dysfunction at all levels of government. It doesn't work like businesses that I ran for 35 years. But we can do a lot of things to improve the efficiency, to provide true checks and balances and exit ramps to give these victims a fighting chance. We haven't done anything to address the inefficiencies of this program in the last 240 years. Mm-hmm. A lot of discussion. We've known the system has been broken since the Associated Press did their big study, groundbreaking study in 1986. And although there's been a lot of rhetoric at the state and federal level, every reform that's been put in place has only protected the bar members. It really hasn't protected the victims. But we're getting smarter and we're building our ranks. And the reason that Michael does what he does and what Elaine does what she does and Sam does what she, and there's several dozen, we all vary in our skills and our ability to communicate, but we are starting to figure out how to work as a union, as a coalition, to get these issues elevated to the American public. Because I'm convinced if we had 1 million family march on the mall and really started making a scene at each state capitol demanding the reforms that SEAR has been promoting since 2016, I'm sure we can make a difference. And that's why my wife and I continue to fight.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely myself as well, to, alert the public about all of this corruption, family court, foster care, CPS, now guardianships. It's just the corruption is just down deep rabbit holes.
It's by design, Maryann.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an engineer. I'm a systems analyst by training. I spent half of my career at GE doing Six Sigma projects, helping teams understand how to put numbers around their process, take your opinions, push them to the side, and let the numbers guide what we do to make better products, safer products, less expensive products. These courtrooms aren't driven off data. The bar wants no data. They want everything based on opinion. And attorneys have some of the wildest opinions I've ever heard, and they tend to prevail. So until we look at this as a system and agree that it's broken and it must be addressed in a different way, things will continue to get worse. But I think we're closer than we've ever been to try to get something done here.
And I appreciate all the work you're doing. I'm sure a lot of families do. Do you ever have a family call in and you're just beside yourself with, trying to find an answer to help them?
Every day.
Yeah.
If you have a heart at all, because I know what they're headed into.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it thousands of times. And some get angry at me because I tell them the cold hard facts about what is likely to occur, and that, okay, you took the first step. You had the courage to call SEAR.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have to have even greater courage, because as you become transparent
Mm-hmm.
with the evidence that condemns the parties that are prevailing, they will retaliate. They will intimidate. They will threaten to sue you personally, because they are absolutely committed, all of them, to making sure the American public is oblivious to what routinely goes on. And that journey from recognizing you and your loved one are being exploited to, I will fight till my last breath to save my loved one, is a courageous journey for anyone who ever undertakes it.
Mm-hmm.
And you love it when you give them the cold hard facts and they say, I'm committed. And then you start with our strategy. And our strategy is simple. It's unconventional. We look at opportunities to rescue the individual. Rescues happen quite often, and people don't go to jail. Many have, but they've made some strategic errors in the way they approach it. And I don't want to go into the details on it, because these people are smart. They want to keep winning. So they love understanding what SEAR's doing, so that they can make sure that when the next one they grab, they don't make a mistake that SEAR might exploit to save a vulnerable adult.
Mm-hmm.
But go to the media, write those letters to county officials. People have to remember, these frauds are committed at the county level. These are local issues. And it all happens because a judge has poor judgment. I feel for equity court judges. Attorneys are in front of them lying up a storm. And if they're doing it in concert, it's nearly impossible for a judge to figure out what's the right decision when I have all this confusion that's being presented, which is on purpose. That's how you get the orders that allow nefarious activity to occur. So you got to expose it. That takes risk. You got to write letters to the county commissioners. You got to write letters to the DA. You got to write letters to the sheriff. Get it into law enforcement and third-party hands outside of the probate or equity court environment. You got to write letters to the chief judge of the court system. Let them know this is what's going on. You also have to build a local team, because most states seal the records. You have to be a court watcher. You have to go in the gallery. You have to give people your card and build that core team of activists in the county that are going to compare notes, compare what attorneys are operating, what frauds are being committed within the petitions, which are routine, and then elevate it to embarrass the system and hopefully create change. It's not easy. Look, we fail 99+% of the time. Many would say, Rick, you're wasting your time. 5,000 cases, and we've saved maybe 100. 8 years of effort, and we've saved maybe 100. Most would say you're nuts. Maybe I'll be in a guardianship next week. I doubt it. But our success rate is terrible. But our success rate is also terrible because we're not building a ranks of allies that are elevating the evidence on a consistent basis to condemn the system and to get the changes that are so needed.
I myself am getting phone calls, and I'm putting people on this podcast to explain what's going on with their guardianship in their family or their family court story, and to educate the public so they all know what's going on, give everyone a heads up as to what they're walking into. And this is bad.
Look, we each play a role, and God bless you for your podcast, Maryann, and God bless Michael for what he does, because he's more media. He's an activist, but he's definitely a media person. We've chosen the tough route. Counseling is not fun. It's very, very emotional, but it's necessary. You got to give these people hope.
Mhm,
and you
mhm,
got to give them direction. And we provide that direction that the attorneys won't give them. They won't even admit they're going to get taken advantage of, which is terrible. But we do that. We spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. on reform. We were recognized for our efforts on back in 15, 16, 17, getting the Elder Abuse Prevention and Prosecution Act passed into law. We're not pleased. That's the other part of legislation that's challenging, because one, you got to be very discreet. Words matter
mhm,
on whether you put legislation in place that really has teeth and penalties associated with it. But then you have to make sure that it's resourced so that somebody's actually going to give it teeth in the
mhm,
marketplace. And in the case of EPA, we got 93 elder justice coordinators assigned, one for each federal district across the country. And to date, we've gotten one conviction for a fraudulent adult guardianship. And it was a juicy one. It
mhm,
was
mhm,
an attorney and guardian down in Florida who put a guy in a fraudulent guardianship, stole his $1 million estate back in 2010. I mean, this guy was hardened. He then became the DA of the county, Columbia County, Florida, and he immediately started taking bribes to not convict criminals that were brought before his prosecutors. And the FBI stepped in and started investigating. And it was interesting, when he was indicted last year, he was convicted in February of this year. The two charges that were on his conviction, and he's now in prison, was the estate trafficking fraudulent guardianship case of Leonard Thomas, who he exploited starting in 2010. So, we're making progress. The FBI and the DOJ now can no longer deny that this isn't a crime, and that they'll do it with cases more than a decade old and for only $1 million. We have cases that are 20 million, 50 million, 200 million, Britney Spears, 60 million. Look, that was all done to traffic her estate. And it
mhm,
wasn't done by her dad. He was a witting lackey in the whole affair. There were over a dozen attorneys that made over $30 million off of her estate to deny her expressed wishes and demands for 13 years.
mhm.
And her estate is still being consumed by those attorneys. Yes, she's free, but they're not going after those attorneys. And those attorneys are still fighting to get paid even more from her estate. And sadly, Judge Brenda Penny in LA County thinks her job is to entertain attorneys. She's not going to hold anyone accountable. She's here to help redistribute assets to fellow members of the bar. And that's being a little coarse, but that's about as accurate as it gets.
Y- And I'm sure this is a global problem. Are you hearing from anyone overseas?
We are. Australia has some major problems. Their system is as liberal as ours. The UK, less so. And Europe, um, their equity courts are set up differently so that there isn't this financial incentive that we have in the States. And that's the big driver here. If the litigators weren't getting carte blanche access to assets by gaining that coveted court order for guardianship, things would change immensely. And so those countries where they have put in checks and balances to ward against that, France, very restrictive guardianship system. It takes a lot for them to remove the rights of an individual. Getting a guardianship, an adult guardianship in the US, it's like getting beads at a Mardi Gras parade.
Mhm,
Anyone can file and anyone can get the guardianship, but no one can get you out. And often it's 5 minutes in and a lifetime of savings before you're released, as was the case in my father-in-law. So when you look at the double standards, the biases that are very real and recognized in the US, it's also very obvious the bar has conspired to make sure that legitimate changes are not made that demonstrate best practices globally.
yeah. Well, the bar extends globally. from what I've also learned as well, that they've got tentacles all over the world.
Oh, you're right. You're right. And the key, it's a great point, Maryann. The key is, how are you adjudicating? How do you ensure the jurist, the person who makes the decision to arbitrate a conflict, is going to look at it, look at the evidence, and honor the law specific to the environment and the facts presented? Um, Different countries do that differently. And the US as a whole has been extremely liberal on this, and that's why it's gotten out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the bar, yeah, right. Every bar member gets into law because they want to, they love the law. That's their thing.
Mm-hmm.
But many because they want to make money. So you're right. If you got a case, I mean, I worked for GE. We had lawsuits that oftentimes transcended country borders. And so sure, I had lawyers that I consulted with in many different countries. So I get it, but it's the laws that apply in that country that control whether the innocent are exploited or not. And in this case, in the US, our laws are pretty liberal, and the innocent often get exploited.
I know this is just terrible. I am, speaking with a mother who's, I believe her daughter's 19, in a guardianship, being heavily sedated with drugs that have gone on, and they should be short-term drugs, but they're just sedating this person, and she's rapidly declined, and she's trying to get her daughter out of this guardianship. You know, and again, like you said, they isolate, and then they won't let the family see their loved one, and they threaten them with jail even when they enter the hospital to see their loved one.
Yeah, the adage, defame legitimate
Mhm.
protectors. The big lie theory works in the equity court quite effectively. And we see Washington State has a VAPO order. The attorneys, the bar, pushed for this years ago. Vulnerable person protective, vulnerable adult protective order. Yeah, VAPO, vulnerable adult protective order. And almost unilaterally, the guardians in Washington State and the attorneys that sponsor them will do VAPOs on the legitimate protector, usually the DPOA holder or the trustee of the family trust, because they got to discredit him. And a VAPO is the easiest way to make sure they're isolated from the loved one and they don't have position in the equity court where the guardianship is created.
Mhm.
But we see that nationwide.
Mhm.
We also coined a term TURT, because a lot of these, and it's named after a daughter victim in Boca Raton, Florida, who was desperately trying to protect her mom, who was in long-term care. Someone suggested guardianship, that you need extra set of hands to help you. And she went to this group and voluntarily put her mom under guardianship, and realized that the people that she had just signed up with were exploiting her mom, actually had sided with the long-term care facility. But once they had guardianship, then they could capture all these bank records, and they built a story and took it to the FBI that got Karen Turk, is the daughter's name. They got her criminally convicted in 2019, and she spent 33 days in a federal prison based on purely fabricated evidence by a well-known predatory probate litigator in Palm Beach County, Florida. We have dozens of cases nationwide where influential local predatory probate litigators will manufacture evidence, data, will manipulate evidence to create a story that gets local law enforcement to investigate. And again, we see this double standard. Families almost never can get law enforcement to investigate these cases. It took us a year to get law enforcement to finally recognize the evidence that got a criminal investigation opened on Helen Matko, the guardian of my father-in-law. We've elevated literally hundreds of cases to local, state, and federal law enforcement and APS nationwide. And they almost unilaterally, once a guardianship has been established, they will look the other way. Why? Because attorneys have influence. They don't want to prosecute attorneys because it's the toughest conviction they'll get. And they definitely don't want to prosecute attorneys who are endorsed by local judges, because that's even tougher to get. You have all this standing court decisions that legitimizes that they're a good person, when in fact, because of the dysfunction in these courts, the actual evidence in the court records might condemn them. But you don't get access, you don't even challenge that because the prosecutors aren't willing to prosecute. So we have some real issues with the system, but we also have a real issue with the bias that law enforcement really doesn't want to take this on as it pertains to attorneys. They're more than happy to take it on with family members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's scary. That is very scary.
Yeah, we've got a case, actually two cases that we're working right now, one in Florida, the other in Texas, where it's going to be interesting when it finally goes to trial. Because, and that's another point to make on it. Things happen, getting access to the estate, condemning a family to frivolous long-term litigation happens within seconds in an equity court. We've got tons of examples where the petition is court stamped in 1 hour, and an hour later, the order's signed and back out the door. No hearing, no notice, no nothing, no inspection of whether this person is incapacitated or not, and they're under guardianship and their life has changed forever. Meanwhile, our average gestation on an elder exploitation and theft case is 3 years. From the time you finally get law enforcement to accept your evidence until they're arrested, the public knows this person has committed, likely has committed a crime, is assumed to have committed a crime by law enforcement, is 3 years. Then it's another year plus, usually 2, to get a conviction. The family courts will defend that party, particularly if it's an attorney, through that entire 5-year process. In the case of professional guardian Tracy Hudson, who got into the business in Pinellas County, Florida, who got into the business, left a well-paying job as an administrator at a local hospital, got into professional guardianship, in short order was the president of the County Guardianship Association in 2016, was exposed in 2018, was ultimately arrested in November of 2019, and since November of 19, so almost 3 years full, the probate court judges who had her guardianships have paid her attorneys over $500,000 from the estates of her victims, proclaiming that until proven guilty, she's innocent, and you can still acquire these assets in these guardianships that were highly suspect from the start to pay your bills to defend the guardian who's now under criminal arrest. You can't make this up. And yet I've challenged the 2 judges in Pinellas County publicly with the county commissioners. You can't defend it. And they know they can. In an equity court, I have discretion and latitude. I have decided she's innocent, and I have every right to continue to pay her attorneys from the estates of her victims. I want every American to digest that logic, because that's often exactly how these courts view their entitlement.
Well said. This is, yeah, they are, the judiciary is just running rampant with a lot of things.
Yeah.
Is there, a silver lining to all of this, somewhere in all of this?
I don't see it yet.
Mhm, mhm.
I'm not
No, I
in this. I'm not in this for self-promotion or riches. I'm sure some might answer that question differently.
mhm,
Our goal is protecting the vulnerable.
mhm,
And we know that, again, evil's a reality. So this is going to be with us till the end of time. But we're not even trying to slow it down.
mhm,
So to me, the silver lining is just a few changes and we can reduce the victimization significantly. There will still be people victimized, but this thing is so out of control now. Our job is getting easier. So I guess that would be the silver lining. It's so, this pendulum has swung so far to out of control that it's
mhm,
rather easy for us to highlight that even with you hiding all the records, Bar Association, it's pretty easy to show that you're committing crimes within these courts.
mhm.
So there's our silver lining, Maryann.
Okay.
It's so bad you can't ignore it now.
That's right, that's right. Well, how can people reach you if they are in a situation like this?
Yeah, our phone number is 804-564-5330. We work with regional coordinators. We have about 20 nationwide that handle the calls, but they all come through that number, 804-564-5330. We delegate them to the regional coordinators to handle the consult and collect the metadata, because although we keep the information confidential, the personal information confidential, we collect the metadata to show where we have issues nationwide, collect
Mhm,
the names of the judges, the attorneys, the counties, et cetera, and the details on the net worth of the ward. Our focus here at SEAR, although we're very sensitive to the emotional and psychological trauma, our focus is the money, because that's the easiest to track.
mhm,
Financial fraud is a relatively easy thing to prove. It's black and white, it's numbers, it's bank statements, it's real estate transactions, and much easier to get a criminal conviction than exploitation, which is a very gray area. But our regional coordinators handle the calls on a local basis, support the activist efforts on a local basis, and we're continuing to add regional coordinators as people demonstrate a passion and a capability for the victims nationwide.
mhm.
We also have our website, www.searjustice.org. And then we have 3 social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The most of what we do is really on Facebook, because what we do is, in general, we take recognized major media articles from around the country. We add a narrative to it based on our knowledge of issues in that particular county, to add more substance to the article and frame the articles that are written. So every day there's new news, if you would, on our Facebook page usually about arrests and convictions of exploiters nationwide, but sadly, a lot of stories about the trauma that a family's going through
Mhm.
that's being elevated in the media, and no one's really doing anything about it, and the family's losing a lot of money trying to get the system to do its job.
What is the name of the Facebook page?
It's all SEAR justice.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I'm so glad you came on the show to speak about this, and I'd like to have you come back on as a return guest.
Maryann, anytime. I've
Okay.
enjoyed the chat. I thank you for what you're doing. All of us play a role in this, whether it's activism or communication or counseling, or lobbying. So it's been a pleasure spending time with you. It's been a pleasure getting to know you through this whole process, and I'd be happy to come back anytime you want me.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, hey, don't jump off. Slam the Gavel's a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these family courtrooms. I'm your host, Maryann Petri, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again here with Rick Black and other exciting guests in the future. Thank you again, Rick.
Thank you.